Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Liz Lang. Each week on this podcast, we will break down various aspects of mental health. We are so excited you're here and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Jeremiah and Selina Woodruff from Core Connection. And this week, we are going to get into when to speak up and be clear instead of quiet. And before we get into that, Jeremiah has this week's parenting moment.
So this week, I thought I might pat myself on the back a little bit. I have an 11-year-old little boy who just loves science and anything to do with science and math. And he does lots of his own little experiments. And the other day, I catch him getting all kinds of things out and I'm trying to figure out what he's doing. And he told me he was trying to create some rocket fuel. For a rocket. And probably years ago, I would have flipped my lid and been like, you can't do that because I know you're going to get stuff all over the kitchen that shouldn't be all over the kitchen. Anyway, and we're talking like baking soda and vinegar type stuff. Mm-hmm. But I took a moment, which was good, and I paused and I said, hey, what are you doing? And he said, Mom said I can do it. I said, okay. And as I see all the different chemicals or products, not really chemicals, but the products out, I thought, that could be problematic with the countertops or the floors. And if it spills it, and he's got food coloring because he wants it to be red. And I was just like, oh my goodness, I need to just shut this down because it'll be easier to not have to clean it up than to let him explore what he's doing. And instead, I just said, hey, where are you planning on doing this at? And he said, oh, Mom said I should go outside and do it. I thought, oh, okay, that's a good choice. Now I feel a lot better. And I was glad that I didn't just get on his case because I think it's important for kids to be allowed to explore things that they're interested in. Now, this 11-year-old little boy of ours is very brilliant. And I'm not just saying that because he's my son, but, I won't get into all the things that he's doing right now in life. His understanding of science is beyond what mine ever was. Mm-hmm. And he just loves studying it. And he learned right away that he came to me, Dad, there's no way to create enough thrust with baking soda and vinegar. Mm-hmm. I've got to find something else. So we're sticking to model rockets for right now. But it was just a good experience for me and for him to not shut him down, but to encourage his creativity and allow him to learn from whatever he's looking at doing with his friends. So it was just kind of a fun experience for us.
Which I love because parenting is all about progress and, taking those steps. Not about perfection. It's about progress.
Very true.
Yeah. Okay. So to recap this theme that we've been on about talking less and how that can create space and how we can be better listeners as parents, right? So today we're going to talk about when parents, they sometimes have to step forward with clarity. So sometimes silence stops helping and guidance is needed, right? So, let's use Jeremiah's example. Say your son was going to introduce some chemicals that were maybe not so safe, or was going to mix some chemicals that were going to create some safety issues. It's then your job as a parent not to listen, but to say, this isn't safe, right? And, that's just a really easy, perfect example. And, sometimes it's obvious where there's danger, right? So, and there's other obvious examples like your kid wants to go to a party and there's going to be drugs or alcohol. That's another time where you can listen to them, but you also have to guide, right? But there could be other areas that are maybe not so obvious. And especially given what we've talked about the last couple of weeks, when your child is really struggling and maybe there's some emotional upheaval going on between their friends at school, or maybe it's grades or something is going on where your child is just, they're just in pain. And, you've been practicing good listening skills, which is fantastic. But it's also important to know when to shift into that guidance mode and into, more information. So tell me your guys' thoughts on this.
Yeah, and it's typically much more complicated than my son's going to try and make real rocket fuel or something. I don't think
Right.
he's going to do that. And he would ask first. Thank goodness he's that type of person. But it's usually a lot more complicated, and it's hard for us as parents, I think, to know. At least it is for me. Maybe the rest of you are great at this, but it can be difficult to know when it's best to stay quiet and when you really need to speak up. Sometimes it's really, really clear and it's simple. Like Liz said, safety is important. When we're talking about using silence, we're looking at allowing our children to process emotions. When we interfere with that, that's where we create problems. But when we stay silent and we allow them that space, we create connection with them. When they're problem solving, we can give them space to problem solve, or we can listen when they're sharing vulnerable thoughts or experiences. But the difference is when there's a safety issue involved, we definitely need to speak up. It's more of an art, I think, than a science, and understanding the balance of listening, using good listening skills that we've talked about in the last few episodes we've done versus, just jumping in and solving the problem. But when, they're looking at compromised values, or they've crossed boundaries, or they're stuck in really unhealthy patterns. For example, we might have an eating issue. We might start seeing the initial signs of anorexia or bulimia for a young girl who maybe doesn't feel like she's fitting in as well. Those kinds of things, we have to speak up. And that's where we're going to want to have conversation. You got to find the balance between listening and speaking up, even in these challenging situations, because we've got to be able to do kind of both of those things at the same time, and be able to know when to do which one. And so hopefully today we can go through maybe some examples to help our listeners kind of clue into where and when they should speak up.
And also, too, noting that, there's probably going to be a time to step back again and listen and process. So I loved your example of an eating disorder, because you're right. There's safety involved. We have to step up. But as they're getting treatment, and disclaimer, in that instance, you need to seek professional help. So there's going to be times in that instance, because this is going to be a big, long process where there's going to be a lot of processing of emotions. And that's going to be a great time to just listen, or to keep quiet and just, kind of be there for your teen. So, there's going to be times to go back and forth. And again, it's subtle. And, this isn't about doing it perfect. That's not what this is. You're not always going to get it right. There's going to be times where you're going to look back and say, yeah, I probably could have stayed quiet. And then there's going to be times you're going to look back and say, maybe I should have spoke up a little bit, because they could have used some guidance, even though safety wasn't an issue at the time. And so don't stress about always doing it right. The point is you're trying. And another thing, don't doubt your instincts, right? Don't doubt your gut. As a parenting, that gut instinct, it's profound, and it's real, and it's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Pay attention. You probably are doing better than you think you are, and you probably know more than you realize. And so paying attention to those internal signals could really go a long ways for you as a parent.
Yeah. So let's go back to this drinking example that I gave, right? So a teen says, everybody drinks at parties. It's not that big of a deal. Tell me your response. Your listening response, and then your clarity response.
Well, we got to be a little bit careful here. And, all of our listeners are going to have a different idea and theory on drinking, because there are certainly those who probably worry less than others about it. In our house, I would probably say something to my kids like, man, I hear what you're saying and you're probably right, but in our home, that's not normal and that's not what we do. And so I'm going to put my foot down, and I'm not going to allow my child to go to a party like that, most likely, if I know about it. Typically your kids aren't telling you they're going to a party where drinking is happening if you have those kinds of rules. But yeah, I would just be really clear with them. Like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and maybe that is pretty normal, but in our house, in our family, we don't think underage drinking is okay. It's illegal. And there's a lot of concerns and risks that come with that. And so we're not going to do that. This is the boundary, and we're going to stick to that. And they may not like it, and that's okay. There's going to be lots of things that we do that our kids don't necessarily love.
It's usually a sign you're doing it right.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
You said some people are maybe wouldn't agree with that or would be okay with their children drinking, but I think that's just an example. You could plug in anything you're not comfortable with that you feel like isn't safe, and that it's crossing a boundary. So whatever that boundary is that you have and you're not comfortable with your child participating in that, it's that simple of just plugging it into that. So you just say, I hear that it feels normal in your friend group, but in our family, fill in the blank. We're not okay with that. And so you're just validating their feelings and not just lecturing them and telling them how they can't do it, but you're validating those feelings of, for them, they're experiencing that they're going to be left out and not be able to participate in what they think everybody else is doing. And they're going to be an outcast. And so you're validating those feelings, but also stating your boundary and where you stand with that.
Yeah, you've got to be clear with that boundary. I appreciate Selina saying that, like, it really doesn't matter what it is. When we're crossing that boundary, validation is important of what they're feeling, and clear expectations is really important. So,
yeah, permissive parenting is never the answer.
Not generally.
Not generally.
I haven't seen it work yet, so maybe there's a case where it does.
Well, I guess anything is possible.
Yep.
So here's an example of something that I liked because it helped me realize. An example is when teens are stuck in negative thinking. So your teen would say, I'm terrible at everything. And at times I think I would be silent because I'm like, hey, I don't want to lecture them and tell them how they're wonderful and tell them all those things because it means nothing to them at that moment when they have to believe it themselves. And so, or don't want to come back with, oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, why would you say that? Oh, really? Everybody, you're terrible at everything. So maybe I would choose silence instead of coming back at them, but realizing that silence could reinforce that belief that they have. They could be interpreting that as me agreeing and not wanting to, I'm not coming back with something different against what they're saying. And so they might take the silence as that's something I agree with. But so a helpful response would be something like, I don't agree with that. I see someone who works hard and cares deeply. And then you could follow up with, what made today feel so discouraging? And so I think that's more helpful to open up the conversation and allow them to express, because yes, they might be over exaggerating by saying I'm terrible at everything and you don't agree with that. But by asking that follow-up question, it helps them to be able to express and feel safe and trust you that they can say what it is that they feel that they're terrible about and get clarity on where they are.
Yeah, I think that Selina's example here is a really perfect example of where it gets a little bit complicated with the good listening skills, the staying silent versus when to respond. Because if your teen says, I'm terrible at everything, and you just dismiss it with something like, oh, no, you're not. You look at this and this and this. Now we've invalidated what they're feeling and experiencing. We've disconnected instead of connected, versus saying something like what Selina said, like, I don't agree with what you're telling me. What I see is this. So what made today feel like it was so discouraging and frustrating for you? That builds the connection. It validates what they're experiencing. And now we've asked a follow-up question with curiosity in mind that provides a space for our child to be a little bit more open with whatever happened today.
And, sometimes kids will say things like that because they're in maybe a really down moment, or maybe they're really emotionally dysregulated, and they might just come back with more argument, right? And so if they just keep arguing, I think that there sometimes is appropriate to maybe back out of the conversation and say, all right, clearly we're heated and let's disengage and then come back. right? Sometimes I feel like that could be appropriate as well. Because oftentimes when kids say something like, I'm terrible at everything, they're in a not so good space emotionally, and there might be something bigger going on.
Well, it could be a cry for help as well, right?
Yes.
And you got to remember, for a teen, things move very, very rapidly. So we could start off the morning at basketball practice and everything goes great, went through school and everything's good and had lots of good experiences. Maybe they had a game that night that they played, a basketball game, and they were even the MVP of the game. They scored lots of points or whatever. And then that night, what you didn't know is that the teacher posted test results for one of their classes and they bombed it. So their experience of, I'm terrible at everything, may just translate into, man, I messed this one up. I just didn't do well on this one thing. And so that's why we want to say something like, what made today feel so discouraging? Because they could have had a wildly successful day with only one hiccup. And for them, it truly feels as though the day has been a disaster because one thing went wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So another time when it could be appropriate to speak up is if teens are just trying to avoid responsibility, right? So, for example, your teen says, oh, the teacher just hates me. So let's give a response to that one.
I'm going to say, really, every teacher hates you, because I feel like you say this all the time.
Yeah.
That's not the response to say.
No, but it's how we feel often, right? And when we're talking about responsibility, we may have a kid that's getting a poor grade, and the reality is that, you know what? It may be because the teacher doesn't like you. We had this situation in our home with one of our kids that it wasn't with them, but one of their classmates. I had one of my kids, I think it was just 2 weeks ago, telling me, I think the teacher really doesn't like this person. And I don't know why, because they tend to pick on this person a little bit. And those kinds of things happen, and it's a little bit frustrating. So anyway, a better response here could be something like, I hear that you're frustrated with your class. Like, you must be having a tough time there. And then, so the guidance you want to bring in here, this is where we're going to speak. We're going to say something like, hey, let's talk about what part of this situation you have control over. And so now we look at what we can control versus what we can't control. We can't control if the teacher doesn't like us. And if that's a true statement, most of the time it's not. Mm-hmm. I think most teachers are pretty dang good people, and they want to help our kids and do lots of good things for them. So now we're going to move into like, what can you control? What are you responsible for? And this is a great teaching opportunity. But again, kind of like Selina's last example, this is a good spot for us to find that balance between listening, active listening, curiosity questions, and a little bit of guidance, so that we can keep them engaged in the conversation and maintain the connection. And so talking with them about what do you have control over, and helping them see that and see what their responsibility is. And this could be in anything, right? Like, this just doesn't work for me, I'm no good at this, is a common excuse when it comes to household chores or things like that, right? Like helping them see like, hey, this is what you have control over and this is where your responsibility is, could be a powerful tool, and not a time to stay silent.
Yeah, so because sometimes staying silent could reinforce victimhood, and the last thing we want is for our kids to feel like a victim. And that can be really easy to do whenever there's a power differential, as there is between students and teachers. And so, I love this idea of what's something you are in control of. What are you responsible for? What do you need to do? Because it puts the responsibility on them. You're not shaming them or just invalidating them, but you are making them responsible for it, which they need to be, because ultimately it is their grade and they're going to, leave the house someday and be responsible for a lot of things. And it's good to give them opportunities to practice that in high school or junior high, whatever the grade may be.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with my children, with teachers, and we talk through what they can control. We talk through what they what they can do. And we talk through the need to understand how to function in a world where we don't always see eye to eye with those around us. We're going to be in situations throughout our lives that we have to learn to manage in a healthy way, and we have to take control of what we're responsible for versus, just blaming somebody else for whatever problems we're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into a real life conversation example. So, for example, a disrespectful tone, right? Your teen comes to me and is like, "Why are you always on my case?" And maybe they were even less kind than that, right? I mean, and you can insert any phrase in here. Why are you such a terrible parent? Why are you so bad at parenting? Okay. So, man, that triggers parents, and I don't blame them, because when your teen gets disrespectful, it's so easy to fall into the "how dare you speak to me that way? I am your parent. Don't do that."
Yeah. And I mean, all of us parents of teenagers have been through that, right? We've all heard those things, and it's tough, but really the most helpful way to end that type of conversation is to say something like, "I'm happy to have a conversation with you when you're ready to speak in a more appropriate tone," or something of that nature. That's the way I would manage that. Because again, we've set a clear boundary that says, "Hey, you're not going to come in and talk to me that way," without you saying you're not allowed to talk to me like that. It just says, "Hey, whoa, here's what I'm going to do. Like, I'm happy to chat with you when you're ready to chat with me in a way that shows respect both ways."
Yeah. So it's inviting respectful dialogue rather than just shutting down communication.
Correct.
Big difference. Okay. How about an unsafe choice? So teen says, "I'm getting in the car with Jake. He only had a couple drinks."
What do you think, Selina?
Yeah, I need to print these off so I can respond the right way. Cause I'd be like, "Oh, heck no."
Right?
And most of us would.
Yeah, right. What's Jake's mom's number? Do I need to call the cops?
Yeah.
You're just you're going to want to catastrophize in your head.
Jake's not going anywhere either. You both can come back in the house.
Right?
Okay, you ready? This was my prepared answer that I'll pull my phone up when I'm in this situation so I can read it appropriately. "I'm really glad you told me." That would be good, right?
Yeah.
"I'm not comfortable with you riding with someone who's been drinking. Let's figure out another way home."
And it's so easy for us to sit here and give these responses when we're not in the heat of the moment. That's so important, right? And the way a parent responds in these scenarios is really critical. It reminds me of a childhood experience when I was, 16 or 17 years old. I was working for this guy, and he had several employees. And one day he decided he was going to have this one employee pick me up because I couldn't drive that far. It was long distance driving. My parents wouldn't give me access to the cars for the entire day and have their cars. But this gentleman picked me up, and he was kind of a crude guy. And I learned a lot more about him later, but he had an old truck and it had issues, and it was a good 2-hour drive to where we were working and a 2-hour drive home. And on our way home, his truck was having some issues, and we stopped by a gas station to let his truck cool down. And he went in and got some alcoholic beverages and was drinking them. And I didn't know what to do. And of course, this is before cell phones. I couldn't have just called my dad and said, "Hey, come pick me up." But anyway, we got going again. And a while later, kind of on a remote road through the back hills on our way home, his truck finally, was done for the day. At least I don't know what happened afterwards. By then he'd had enough to drink that the alcohol had settled in a little bit. He became even more crude and pretty disrespectful. And he told me to start hitchhiking. And I'm just a kid thinking, my parents told me I shouldn't hitchhike. Like, what am I going to do? And he was upset and angry because his truck wasn't working. And so he started sticking his thumb out. And when people didn't stop, he was flashing them, exposing himself to people. Wow. And I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to walk home. I mean, I could be home in 2 hours if I walk from where I'm at. It's fine. And so I got a ways away, and this wonderful woman stopped because I was a few hundred yards past where he was at. And she could tell that obviously I was a kid versus an adult. And she says, "Hey, are you okay? Like, what's going on? That guy is not going to get any help." And I said, "No." She goes, "I just live right up the road. Do you have somebody you could call to come pick you up?" And I said, "Yeah, I could call my dad." And so I called my dad, and I was terrified of how my dad was going to respond. And so I told him just the truth, what's happened. And he responded just like what Selina said. And he said, "I'm glad you told me. I'm on my way. Why don't you just stay right there, and I'll be there in a few minutes." Because we really weren't that far in a car. We were for a walk, but not in a car.
Yeah.
And he came and picked me up, and my dad, being the kind person he is, I said, "Don't pick him up. No, I don't want him back in the car with me."
Right.
But my dad went and picked him up and took him home too. And it was just a great experience for me. And it was a great lesson that my dad taught me on how to respond in stressful situations. And I think Selina's example is, a perfect one. If we can maintain our composure and not respond the way Selina initially suggested, which is probably how I would respond as well. Most of us would. That's a tough situation.
It is. Well, it's scary, and safety is our number one priority as parents.
Yep.
All right. Social media pressure. Everyone has social media and post pictures like this. It's normal. Oh, is it now? Oh, really?
Oh, really? Well, if anybody's been listening to this podcast, they already know our stance on social media. So
you don't call the moms and tally up if everyone is, so you can show your kids and be like, "I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and so everyone is not." I always validate myself with that.
Right?
Truth.
Okay. What's the right way? What's the right way to do it?
I think the right way here is something along the lines of like, yeah, I get that probably feels pretty normal based on what we see in the world. And I'm still really concerned about those pictures being shared and being used. I don't think it's a good idea. And so now we're going to go right back into that curiosity questioning, right? And invite discussion with, what do you think about this? And let's talk about it and help us understand why we want to be cautious with social media posts. And we can get into some education pieces because it really is important. I had my own businesses throughout my life, and I've hired lots of people, and most of them I've looked up on social media, and there have been those I have not hired based on what their social media profiles look like. And that's a pretty common practice. And so helping our kids understand that stuff is there forever, and it might not best represent you a few years from now could be super helpful. That's why we have parents, right? To guide us through those things.
All right. Next week, we are going to get into loving the teen you have, and we will see you all next week. Have a question? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com.